The splendour of the British landscape has inspired our greatest painters, writers, and composers. I'm on a journey to discover these places and find out why they were excited by them. I'm travelling to the east of England, to Suffolk, the birthplace of John Constable, one of England's best-loved painters, to the soft turf of Newmarket, home of British racing, to the Norfolk Broads with its barges and windmills, and to the wilder shores of the North Sea. East Anglia is a land of distant horizons, immense skies, the birthplace of some of the most idyllic and comforting British landscape paintings. And yet it's a place of mystery, haunted, isolated in its swirling mists, a corner of England unlike any other, the flatlands. My journey begins in the Stour Valley in Suffolk. This is where the painter John Constable grew up. His paintings of an England that's largely vanished still entrance us, make us imagine going back in time. This is Dedham Vale, part of the Stour that Constable knew and loved best, and made famous by his painting. He came back here once in his later years and was travelling by stagecoach and turned to two strangers in the coach and said, "Isn't this beautiful countryside?" And quick as a flash, one of them replied, "This, sir, is Constable country." I think Constable must have been very pleased. Constable grew up working in the prosperous mill his family owned at Flatford. His father wanted him to take over the business, but Constable was determined to become a painter. After going to art school in London, he came home to the country he'd been brought up in. "I paint my own places best," Constable once said, "the sound of water escaping from mill dams, willows, old rotten banks, slimy posts, brickwork. This place made me a painter." And his biggest landscapes have all been done within a mile of here, but this, of course, is the most famous of all, the setting for the hay wain. Constable's most famous painting shows the view he saw every day as a boy. At the water's edge is the cottage of Willie Lott, the old neighbour who lived all his life by the mill pond. It's a sparkling summer's day, and all's well with the world. It's interesting to stand here and look at the scene as it is today, and there's scarcely any difference. Of course, the cart isn't in the water, the dog isn't there. It'd be nice if they were, actually, but Willie Lott's house on the corner, exactly as Constable painted it. The interesting thing is you stand here and you cannot help but look at this through Constable's eyes. It's a good demonstration of how powerfully artists can influence the way we look at something. I mean, I dare say that if Constable hadn't painted this picture of the Haywain, people would walk past this place and wouldn't give it a second glance. But because of this picture, they come here in their thousands and stand and look and see it through his eyes.
Today, the trees and shrubs are painstakingly pruned to recreate the look of Constable's picture.
Hi there. What's the plan? What are you doing here?
Opening up the view for a picture of the Haywain.
Did you study the painting before you started?
I've lived here all my life and we've got a picture of it at home. And
Were you brought up with it on the,
yes.
on the living room wall?
Yeah.
Did it give you a strange feeling to be remaking a painting?
I think it just makes me feel lucky to live here and to be able to do stuff somewhere where you can actually say, you know, the Haywain, we worked there.
It is an English thing. It's the greenery, it's the trees, it's the water, it's the old 17th century buildings.
Do you think we see it as Constable saw it?
If he came back and was to look over, I'm sure he'd go, well, yeah, it's pretty much as I remembered it. I don't think it'd be...
Constable's paintings capture the day-to-day scenes along the River Stour. His attachment to this place lasted all his life. It was here that he first fell in love with a local girl called Maria Bicknell. He wooed her along these riverbanks, and despite the opposition of her family, he finally married her. When his father died, Constable painted a picture of the family mill. He had decided against taking it over, and instead left Flatford to live in London. Painting is but another word for feeling, Constable once said, and this was his emotional farewell to his father and his childhood home.
When I first started in television, I worked in this part of the world, so I got to know the flatlands quite well and became very fond of them. I had an open car, and it was summer, and I used to drive around with music playing and thinking, oh, this is heaven. It's very special, and it's particularly so because it's so cut off. You know that the roads don't go anywhere, they go to the sea and that's it. But the people who live here are always complaining about the communications, but actually, secretly, I think they quite like the idea that they're just that bit removed.
A few miles upstream from Constable Country is the market town of Sudbury, birthplace of another great English painter, Thomas Gainsborough. At heart, Gainsborough was a landscape painter, but he made his name painting the aristocrats and the celebrities of the day.
Gainsborough didn't sell many landscape paintings in his lifetime. It was the portraits of the rich and the famous that made a painter's reputation and his fortune. And in fact, when you think of Gainsborough, you think of those proud men in their tights and their beautiful jackets, the women in gorgeous silks falling to the ground. But Gainsborough was always captivated by scenery. He once said, "Portraiture is my profession, landscape is my pleasure.
This picture combines Gainsborough's profession and his pleasure. It was painted to celebrate the marriage of Robert Andrews and Frances Carter. But it's as much a celebration of the landscape as of two people newly married. The golden fields, the majestic oak trees, and the skies of Suffolk.
And here, 250 years later, is the very oak tree at the centre of Gainsborough's most famous picture, here on the Aubrey's estate. Mr. Andrews stood here with his gun under his arm, his wife in her beautiful dress sitting on a bench just there, and their estate stretching out, rolling away into the distance behind them.
Just over the hill sits Cornard Wood, or Gainsborough's Forest, as it's sometimes called.
There's not that much of a forest left these days, but these are the very woods where Gainsborough developed his passion for landscape painting. And it's said that he used to forge notes from his father to the school, excusing him from school, so that he could spend the entire day truanting up here, drawing in this lovely landscape.
You can trace the curve of today's road in the track through the woods, in one of Gainsborough's finest pictures. It's a scene of country people using their land, man and nature in harmony. In a clearing in the forest, a woodcutter bundles sticks. A labourer rests on his shovel under the admiring glance of a milkmaid. Two travellers, one with his dog, one on horseback, head for the distant village of Great Henny. And all framed by the canopy of Gainsborough's forest. Travelling north from the woods and streams of the Stour Valley, we reach Newmarket, home to the sport of kings. It was here that one man became the unchallenged master of the art of painting the horse, George Stubbs. Stubbs came to Newmarket to paint the finest racehorses of the day.
Is this rubbing down?
Yeah, well, I'm going to give him a bit of a wash here because he's sweat bad here.
Stubbs's pictures all had horses being rubbed down with straw. Do you do that still?
Like a wisp.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, you're getting some yards, you know, old-fashioned things.
Old-fashioned to use straw, is it?
Yeah.
Stubbs lovingly captures every contour and muscle of the body. Part of the excitement of his pictures comes from his understanding what makes a powerful horse.
So go on, I can see an animal with 4 legs and a head. Tell me what's needed to make a good racehorse.
A good sign is like a big apple bottom. That is where the engine is at the back.
Apple bottom, you call it?
And this is Molly. Now look at her.
I mean, she looks lovely, but what is it about her that's...
It's a shape for a kick-off, what Rolly told you. Look at the size of her bum. Look at that. That's the engine. That's the BMW in her. Oh, she's having a stretch. Look, not many horses do that, is there?
That, no.
She said, oh, I'm ready for it. She's getting ready to go.
racecourse is a wonderfully exciting place, of course. Everybody cheering at the end of the race. The bet's been laid. The thunder of horses going past. And yet Stubbs paints his horses calm, strong, dignified, majestic, almost as though they're above it all.
Stubbs was invited to Newmarket by Lord Bolingbroke to paint his racing superstar, Gimcrack. It was July 1765, and this was the most exciting race of the season, a duel between Gimcrack and Sir James Lowther's Asham.
Can I have 20 on Clueless?
£10.
Good afternoon. To win Clueless. I wanted 4 to 1 and it's gone 7 to 2.
It just goes to show you, see. You've got to get up in the morning.
There's 20 quid.
On 4?
On number 4 to win.
You're right
Yes.
about Clueless, you and me both.
You think you're Clueless?
I am clueless.
I reckon.
Absolutely clueless.
I reckon it's a good name because everybody thinks it won't work well, but it's a lovely horse.
I placed £20 on Clueless. Bolingbroke had 1,000 guineas riding on Gimcrack, £100,000 in today's money.
They're off. Length and a half left of Clueless, black and yellow stripes on the sleeves. She's up on the outside of Welling. Just behind now Clueless, the yellow jacket, white cap, who makes very swift headway. A length and a half away left of Clueless. She's got into it, but now has to be rousted along by Kieran Fallon.
Come on, Clueless!
Clueless on the outside is galloping on, trying to get to the... But Top Gear wins from Signatory, Epticar, Clueless and Kalamka.
Fourth. The favourite and fourth. Oh well. So there goes Clueless. My money's gone. But this great race with Gimcrack, the odds were 5 to 4 on Gimcrack. It was a long race, 30 furlongs, it's just over 4 miles. And in the end, after a tight-run thing, Gimcrack won. And Bolingbroke was a happy man and made a lot of money. And the first thing he did was to commission Stubbs to do a painting of his horse and of this moment of crowning glory.
I'm crossing the border into Cambridgeshire.
This is Byron's Pool near Grantchester, where Lord Byron used to swim. And still at dawn, his ghostly lordship swims his pool, according to another English poet 100 years later, Rupert Brooke, who also swam here, who loved this place. For him, it epitomized everything about England and English life that was desirable. He talked about the sweet water, the unforgettable smell of it, the brown colors. He used to swim here with his friends naked. You'd be glad to know that because of the pollution and the weeds, to say nothing of the nakedness, I have no intention of following his example.
Rupert Brooke was a charismatic young poet who became the voice of that lost generation of the First World War. He made Grantchester his home and spent many hours in this orchard, writing poetry and drinking tea with his friends.
2 years before the outbreak of the First World War, Brooke was staying in Berlin and feeling very homesick for this place that he loved so much. And he wrote one of his best-known poems, The Old Vicarage, Grantchester, in which he describes the glories of Cambridgeshire as the best part of England, and says in the poem that of that district, I prefer the lovely hamlet Grantchester. He goes on, for Cambridge people rarely smile, being urban, squat, and packed with guile. And then he's rude about every village all around. The Ditton girls are mean and dirty, and there's none in Harston under 30. But Grantchester, Grantchester, there's peace and holy quiet there. Great clouds along Pacific skies. And the poem ends with those famous words, yet stands the church clock at 10 to 3, and is there honey still for tea?
When war broke out in 1914, Brooke enlisted in the Royal Navy, and he died on active service. A few months earlier, Brooke had written a poem which embodied his feelings for England. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's, breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. I'm leaving Grantchester to enter a rather different world. This is the fen country. Fen, the Old English word for wet field. Today, most of these fields have been drained, a feat of engineering that had its origins in the Middle Ages.
I'm sure people who live in the fens know it like the backs of their hands, but if you're a visitor here, it actually all looks the same. You don't even know if you're lost. What you really need is a kind of bird's eye view of it. Well, this is certainly the best way to see the fens. I mean, this tells it all. Black earth, water everywhere into the far distance, so you can imagine what it was like before the fens was actually drained. And the view really unchanged for hundreds of years.
Back in the early years of the last century, this landscape inspired a young composer, Ralph Vaughan Williams, to paint his own vision of the fens in music.
I've never been up in a balloon before. I'm a bit chicken, actually, to tell the truth. We're about to land, and fingers crossed, it's quite calm. We'll see how it goes. Hey!
We're going over.
How you doing?
Well, it's terrific. Here we are on our backs in the middle of a scrub field, but it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought, but it was quite surprising. And here we are with a worm's eye view of the fens instead of a bird's eye view. The funny thing is, this is the only field in all direction, everywhere else, I mean, that's rough to land on, because everywhere else is crops.
Peter and Stephen Wortley are identical twins born within 10 minutes of each other. They've farmed this land all their lives.
I like the farming life. You can hear the birds are tweeting like today. You know, I think that's as good as anything. Yeah.
On a nice day like today, what better life can you have? We can't think of anything a better way of earning your living, not a lovely day like today.
And do you think it's beautiful countryside for you? I mean, to look at?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, you get here. The scenery is nice. We get some land on hills. You can see a long way.
You call those hills?
Yeah, well, we call them hills. That used to be flat. Yeah, the high spots we could call them. Yeah, that's it.
The high spots are about 6 inches high.
That's it.
Our father, he's been here all his life. He's now 95 and never slept away from a place and never had a holiday.
Never actually slept away from home?
Never, ever slept away from home in 95 years.
How did he find a wife if he didn't leave the farm for...
Well, my mother was in the Wrens, and my aunt was in the Wrens with her, and she brought him down, and he met my mother in the house. I'm sure he'd have never got married if he hadn't met my mother in the house. He met her in the house he lived in now.
The Wortley family are rooted in the place they live in a way that most families were 100 or more years ago. The poet John Clare would have recognised the Wortleys' passion for their landscape. Clare was born in 1793. He grew up in poverty, working on the land, and thought of himself as the peasant poet. John Clare loved the flatlands, the wide open spaces of his childhood which represented freedom. Every tree and every flower a celebration of nature and a reason for contemplating the purpose of life. Field thoughts to me are happiness and joy, where I can lie upon the pleasant grass or track some little path and so employ my mind in trifles. But Clare's joy was short-lived. In the early 19th century, the common land, the open fields, which his family, like many others, had worked for centuries, was taken away from them. As part of the Enclosure Acts, common land was being put in private hands. John Clare despised the enclosures. He saw the ruin of the countryside that he knew. He used to roam for miles, seeing villages destroyed, farm workers impoverished, gypsies and travellers no longer allowed to use the common land. He wrote about it, enclosure came and every path was stopped. Each tyrant fixed his sign where paths were found. Clare fell into depression. He suffered from delusions, seeing what he called blue devils. In 1837, he was consigned to a lunatic asylum. But much of his finest poetry was written while he was locked away. I long for scenes where man hath never trod, a place where woman never smiled or wept, there to abide with my Creator, God, and sleep as I in childhood sweetly slept, untroubling and untroubled where I lie. The grass below, above the vaulted sky. John Clare kept a daily journal. The entry of Tuesday, the 20th of July, 1841, reveals that he escaped from the asylum and set off to go home to his village, a journey of 80 miles, which he accomplished in only 4 days. He slept in the ditches, he had no food, he resorted to eating grass, which he said tasted a little like bread. And when he got to his village, there was no welcome for him there. He wrote, "I'm homeless at home." North of the Fens, you feel at times you're in a foreign country, more Holland than England, with its tulips and its windmills. Like much of Holland, this is a land reclaimed from the sea. No surprise then that some of East Anglia's greatest painters, like John Crome, took their inspiration not from English painting, but from the work of Dutch artists.
I'm trying to get to one of those last remaining windmills, the kind that Crome painted, but it's almost impossible to get to them. Either the roads are blocked by water or by marshland, and in the end you just have to resort to going by boat, which suits me anyway. Here we are in the very watery heartland of Norfolk, the Norfolk Broads.
John Crome lived in the isolated village of Wensum, known to locals as Over the Water, and he rarely left this remote place.
That's great. Thanks very much. Bye-bye. It's not just the landscape and these windmills that can make Norfolk seem a foreign country. When Crome first went to London, he was treated as though he were a foreigner. It was 1806 and he was submitting a work to the Royal Academy. They couldn't understand a word he said. They couldn't even get his name right. And when the picture was finally hung in the Academy, they spelt it wrong.
Crome's paintings were the start of an artistic flowering in Norfolk at the beginning of the 19th century. It became known as the Norwich School of Painters. For all of them, the Norfolk landscape was a consuming passion. And at the heart of the Norfolk scene was the romantic image of the windmill.
This is a very perilous position on the top of this windmill, not least because I have a sort of 2-foot parapet behind, but I'm told it's perfectly safe and there's nothing to worry about. Even though the windmills are turning and there's a gust of wind, this thing is threatening to hit us on the head. But the view makes it all worth it. Lovely. It's quite light. Can you get heavier?
In 1806, when the Norwich School of Painters was flourishing, one son of Norfolk came back home. John Sell Cotman had left to seek his fortune in London, and he'd even exhibited at the Royal Academy when he was only 18. He returned to paint the landscape of his childhood. Cotman's paintings of the Broads capture a world now almost vanished. They celebrate life on the water, especially life aboard the giant wind-powered barges of the Broads, the Norfolk wherries.
So what were these wherries used for? I mean, when were they at their peak?
Oh, well, the peak would have been, I suppose, the 1870s, 80s. And then after that, once the railways got a grip, that was it then, and they slowly petered out.
And what was their job? What did they actually do on the Broads?
They would carry anything that needed moving on the rivers, and that would be building materials, farming, corn and barley, just about anything you wanted.
So you've got a crew of 1, 2, 3, 4, half a dozen or so today.
Yes.
What would the old wherrymen have sailed?
Either on their own. Or,
on their own?
Yes, on their own, a wherry this size, or more possibly 2 of them, a skipper and his boy, yeah. Oh yes, my Uncle Billy, he sailed his 40-tonner like this on his own.
And that was to save money, I suppose?
No, that wasn't necessarily. No, he was just a bit mad, so nobody would go with him. Yeah.
Cotman started to flout convention, daring to experiment with shapes and colours. To our modern eyes, these paintings no longer seem surprising, but in the early 19th century, he was a painter ahead of his time. He fell out of favour, and he was haunted by the fear of being forgotten.
In 1810, Cotman set off again for London from Norwich. He was determined that the Royal Academy should take his pictures once again, but he failed. Another gallery took them, but nobody wanted to buy them. He was a very sad figure. He had been a star as a young man, and then it had just fizzled out. When he died in 1842, he didn't even merit a single obituary.
St Helen's Church in Ranworth is known locally as the Cathedral of the Broads. I've come here to see one of Britain's historic treasures, the Ranworth Antiphona, an illustrated 15th century songbook.
St Andrew on his cross, behind a wood, a meadow, and beautiful decorations all around. The extraordinary thing is this is illuminated in Norfolk, they think at the beginning or middle of the 15th century. The early church turned its back on all this, didn't like flowers, didn't like gardens, didn't like landscape, thought that was all liable to corrupt the soul. And here we have the most beautiful example of landscape painting, you could call it. And here's another one. And this, Jonah, very suitable for the Broads, Jonah being regurgitated from the fish. Again with meadow behind with flowers in it, and a fish that they say looks rather like a Broadland pike, which would be very appropriate. And the whole thing, once again, beautifully illustrated all the way around, with very fresh, lively flowers. Beautiful.
Britain's most celebrated seafaring hero, Horatio Nelson, was the subject of countless epic paintings. Nelson was born in the little village of Burnham Thorpe. He never forgot the place that made him. "I'm a Norfolk man, and I glory in being so." The pub where he used to drink, which he knew as the Plough, was renamed in his honour. 2 years after his victory in the Battle of the Nile in 1798, Nelson sailed to his home port of Great Yarmouth, and his arrival was celebrated in this painting, Return of the Hero.
Nelson, who'd lost his right arm at the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife, stepped ashore to a great cheering crowd, the flags all flying, the mayor of the town there to offer him the freedom of the borough. And when the town clerk stepped forward with the Bible for Nelson to swear the oath, Nelson put his left hand on it. And the town clerk said, "Your right hand, my lord?" And Nelson replied, "I left that at Tenerife."
Nelson's heroism captured the imagination of the whole country. After his death at the Battle of Trafalgar, he became one of the favourite subjects for artists of the day.
His time here is commemorated now by this drink. It's called Nelson's Blood. This is based on the story that Nelson, after he'd been killed at the Battle of Trafalgar, was pickled in a barrel of spirits, and the sailors on board drank it because they thought that the mixture of the rum and his blood would give them strength. This doesn't have blood in it, this is rum and spices, and whether it gives me strength or not, well, we shall see.
Country estates seem bigger and more impressive in Norfolk than anywhere else. It's as though the flat landscape encourages bold design. This is Hokum Hall. Before the park was laid out, there was nothing but salty marsh, windswept and treeless.
The genius behind Hokum Hall was William Kent. Kent was a painter, but he was unsuccessful, and he threw away his brushes and his palette and instead turned to landscape design. And this is the result of what happens when you give a painter the entire landscape as his canvas.
In 1722, William Kent was hired by Thomas Cook, Earl of Leicester, as architect and landscape designer of Hokum.
Kent introduced to England the idea of designing a garden and park to be seen from inside the house rather than by somebody walking around outside. And so, in the far distance, for instance, an obelisk, the obelisk framed by two columns under the portico, and that framed by this window. And when you go outside, the land just in front of it has been dipped before it lifts up to the hill. In other words, he's taken this countryside and changed it, improved it, to create an idealized image, a picture like the classical landscape which he so admired.
It was the paintings by the French artist Claude Lorrain that Thomas Cook had collected on the continent, which Kent imitated when he designed Hokum. Landscape usually inspires the artist. This time, it was the other way round, Kent bringing the paintings to life.
As he trained as a classical artist, he believed that all landscape was a classical painting. He actually planted a dead tree just to create the right atmosphere.
And he brought the hill down here.
Yeah, that's right. He flattened the top of the hill and then actually graded the slopes down.
How well suited is this part of Norfolk to that kind of reconstructing of the landscape?
Brilliant, because people say Norfolk is flat. It's not. It's not very high ground, but it's very undulating. And I think he actually built the park to reflect the county.
The closer you get to the coast, the more vulnerable the land becomes. Sluices, dikes and seawalls conspire to keep the North Sea at bay. This watery landscape has been invoked in many a mystery tale. It was the setting for a famous 1930s detective story, The Nine Tailors, by Dorothy L. Sayers. Sayers pictured this place as perfect to get away with murder. Evidence can be washed away by the tides, bodies slide silently into swamps. Even the sound of church bells across the marshes takes on a menacing note. Sayers' father was rector in a local parish. The bell tower in the village church of Terrington St. Clement was the stage for one of her most disturbing scenes.
It's New Year's Eve, and a thief and murderer called Geoffrey Deacon has been tied up and imprisoned here in the belfry. Unknown to his captor, the villagers have decided that they'll bring in the new year by celebrating with a 9-hour peal of these bells. In Dorothy Sayers' words, it was like an assault of devils, grinding, bludgeoning, randan, crazy, intolerable torment. And when it's over, Deacon is found dead. He's been unable to endure the torture of the bells. Is it heavy? Can I have a go?
You can try and catch that with me.
Right. Got lost now.
It's all right.
You're right, you seem to be in danger of going up with it.
A little bit behind that drop.
Is that my fault?
Oh, that's all right.
I could do this all day.
Yeah.
Dorothy Sayers had a 9-hour peal rung in this tower. What's the longest you've ever rung here?
Nearly 3 hours.
3 hours. Could you do 9 hours?
I don't think so, no.
Why?
I'm a bit too advanced in years.
Would the noise be loud enough to kill somebody if they were up there?
It would be very uncomfortable, though.
Right?
Very uncomfortable. I don't think it would kill them.
I've come almost full circle, crossing back into Suffolk with its long beaches and fishing villages. The composer Benjamin Britten grew up on this coast. He lived in Aldborough for the last 30 years of his life. He once said he'd tried to live elsewhere, but this coastline was like a magnet, always dragging him back.
Britain had an ear that was very finely tuned for the natural sounds of the sea, the waves, the wind, the gulls. In his opera Peter Grimes, there's an interlude called Dawn, in which he actually captures the sound of the sea sucking at the shingle.
Peter Grimes is the tragic story of a fisherman whose young apprentice dies in mysterious circumstances. Grimes' solitary behaviour arouses suspicions among the villagers, and they wrongly accuse him of murder. Everywhere he goes, he hears the whispers of local gossips. He calls them those voices that will not be drowned. An outcast from the community, Peter Grimes finds his only consolation at sea.
Do you see the sea as a friend or as an enemy?
That's friendly today, but that's not always as friendly. That can be quite nasty.
Do you know its habits?
Yeah, you can, through the years, you can sense what is going to happen, even if the forecast is fine, and you can feel that don't look quite right. That's time to up anchor and get home as quick as possible.
Are fishermen superstitious?
Yeah, very much so. I was not wearing anything green in the boat or having anything green coloured in the boat. You mustn't mention animals on board, anything to do with animals.
What, you can't talk about your dog or your cat?
No, you shouldn't have said that.
Oh, sorry.
That's just an ongoing thing that's been going on for years and years, and if something goes wrong between here and the beach, we'll blame you for what you just said.
Sorry. At the end of the opera, Peter Grimes, hounded by the villagers, is in despair. He's urged to go to sea, sink his boat, and drown himself. The desperate words of Peter Grimes are captured in this sculpture on the beach at Aldborough. It's a memorial to Benjamin Britten. The sculpture's the work of the artist Maggie Hambling.
The idea is you see this rather strange object rising up out of the shingle. When you come round to this side, I hope there's a sort of explosion to the piece that is what happened inside me the first time I heard his music.
Because I saw it coming along the seashore, and it looks immediately like a great seashell that's been swept up the beach.
Jolly good, very good, very good.
The North Sea has also inspired many of Hambling's paintings. You didn't always paint the sea, did you? What sort of started you off?
It was a storm, raging, fantastically exciting. And I went back to my studio. And I happened to be working on a little portrait of a beggar. And it wasn't going at all well. And around me, around my studio, the storm was still raging. So I thought, what the hell are you doing, painting this beggar in the middle of Suffolk when you have this fantastically exciting... So that is how the first little sea painting happened. And then they went on, and I'm still obsessed with this bit of sea. It has to be like that. I mean, it's one's lover.
You feel you own it?
Well, I don't think I know that one owns a lover, but it's that kind of relationship.
So you're jealous?
Close.
It looks like a drab stretch of shingle and a cold grey North Sea.
But it does today.
So, what is it about it that makes it special?
Well, I mean, it's full of infinite variety. If you're attached to this piece of sea, it's unlike any other piece of sea. People say it's all grey. It's actually incredibly full of colour.
The whole coastline along this stretch of Norfolk and Suffolk is constantly eroded by the aggressive sea. A few miles from Aldborough, you can't help but be reminded how the flatlands are in its power. During the Middle Ages, this was the site of Dunwich, one of the largest ports in England. But over a period of 300 years, the town was swallowed up by the sea. The drama of Dunwich being devoured by the waves was an irresistible challenge to that master of British sea painting, William Turner. By the time Turner was painting, dunnage had vanished, and he shows the remains of a pale and ghostly town perched above a turbulent sea.
It's eerie to think that under this grey water lies an old English town. Streets and houses and churches and shops. They do say that at certain states of the tide or the wind, you can still hear the sounds of the church bells ringing under the water. Well, maybe not.
In 1829, the East Coast inspired John Constable after he had suffered a terrible loss. Maria Bicknell, the wife he adored, had died of consumption at the age of only 41. In his misery, he painted Hadley Castle.
After Maria's death, Constable said, "Never again shall I feel as I have felt. The world is totally changed to me." The man who once said that painting was just another word for feeling had found here the perfect place to express his own sense of desolation and loss.
The bleak East Coast is far removed from the safe and comforting world of Constable country. In painting it, Constable proved himself again a master of using the countryside to explore the landscape of his own soul, just as he had in happier times, when he painted those pictures which still lift our spirits today.